This whole week is really an opportunity to really think and to investigate some of these big questions about what it means to be human. And sometimes the problem when it comes to the big questions of life is that we don't always think for ourselves, but we just kind of regurgitate what other people say. We copy others. It reminded me of a story of a little boy at school called Johnny. And his teacher called him into the classroom one day and said, "Johnny, I think you've been cheating in your exam." And Johnny says, "No, it wasn't me, sir." But the teacher said, No, I think you were cheating on the exam and you were copying your friend Tommy. And he said, "Well, how do you know that?" He says, "Well, here I have your exam paper, Johnny, and here is Tommy's. And in question 1, you say the answer is 10, and Tommy says the answer is 10, and you're both correct." And Johnny says, "Well, so what, sir? Doesn't make any difference." He said, "Wait. Question 2, Tommy says the answer is 5, and you say the answer is 5, and you're both wrong." And he says, "Well, so what, sir? It's just coincidence." He said, "Wait. In question 3, Tommy has written, 'I don't know.' And you have written, 'Neither do I.'" Now, maybe when you're 5 and you're cheating an exam, that's okay. But when it comes to the big questions of life, it is important, isn't it, to think for ourselves. And that's what we want to encourage this week, to really think deeply about some of these big questions of life. And we're talking today about this question of truth. We went out onto the university today and we were asking people where they thought truth came from. And people were giving various different responses to that question. But truth, of course, is an interesting concept, particularly in the climates that we live in. The Collins English Dictionary every year produces or announces the word of the year, a word that sums up the kind of cultural and political discussions of the previous year. In 2016, the word that was the word of the year was the word Brexit, and we won't talk about that tonight. But in 2017, the word was fake news. And it was obviously the concept, particularly in 2017, but certainly since then, that has been talked about a lot. The idea that news can be fake news, and the way that news can travel fast around the world. BuzzFeed, at the end of the last couple of years, have produced a list of the top 10 pieces of fake news by the amount of times they've been shared on Facebook. And I succumbed to BuzzFeed's advertising. And I'll just give you the top 8, okay? So in number 8, North Korea agrees to open its doors to Christianity. No, it hasn't. At number 7, 2 altar boys were arrested for putting weed in the sensor burner. Clever idea, but no, they didn't. Number 6, Florida man arrested for tranquilizing and raping alligators in the Everglades. Thankfully, he didn't. Number 5, Donald Trump ends school shootings by banning schools. Not sure whether anyone believed that, but it did make me laugh. Number 4, Michael Jordan resigns from the board at Nike and takes his Air Jordans with him. Number 3, woman sues Samsung for $1.8 million after cell phone gets stuck inside her vagina. Number 2, which I'm not sure, I think this basically was fake news because they announced it before it actually happened. Former First Lady Barbara Bush dies at 92. She did, I think it was just announced rather early. But number 1, lottery winner arrested dumping $200,000 of manure on ex-boss's lawn, which made me smile, but unfortunately, you might say, is not true. So they're all examples of fake news. Now, that kind of fake news can make us laugh, and we can think, well, maybe it's a little bit original, and I don't know what it shows about contemporary culture other than possibly we're very gullible. But of course, sometimes fake news is more serious, isn't it? When fake news influences people and influences world events and political decisions, it isn't so much a laughing matter, is it? And it's amazing how lies and untruths can spread like wildfire. You may have heard this expression, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. Now, that wasn't an expression that was invented after the advent of the internet, but actually 400 years ago. But actually, since the advent of the internet and social media, it's particularly true, isn't it? It's particularly true because it's very easy to share things without really thinking. And it's particularly true because it's very easy to make up stories without having to give any particular sources to the stories that you're sharing. So we see the effects of fake news and untruth. But a question that I'd like us to think about more generally in regards to this topic is this: is there such a thing as truth? Does truth actually exist? Objective, or we might say absolute truth. And actually some people would say no, it doesn't. A philosophical trend over the last 20 or 30 years is the philosophical trend of postmodernism that denies the reality of such a thing as objective or absolute truth. We use expressions like, that's true for you but not for me, to say that actually truth is subjective and it's personal. It's not objective or universal. Now, there's a few problems I want to suggest with that philosophical idea of postmodernism. The first is actually, internally, it seems to be contradictory because it's making an absolute statement to deny the reality of any absolute statements. You're saying there is absolutely no such thing as absolute truth, which seems to sound like an absolute truth claim. But also the reality is, although we may talk about truth being relative and there being no such thing as absolute truth, we only normally talk about that in areas of life that we don't really care that much about. In areas of life that are important, often we like the idea that there is such a thing as absolute truth. Most people don't want to go to a postmodern doctor. Most people don't want to get into an aeroplane with a postmodern pilot. We like the idea that there are some things that are absolutely true that we need to adhere to, that we can't get away from. And actually, think about more meaningful and perhaps emotional things. There are so many injustices in our world, aren't there? So much inequality. Countries where people's human rights are denied them. Are we to say that our desire for justice and equality and human rights is just a relative truth that we happen to hold in the West, but it doesn't matter if other parts of the world don't hold them? Or do we believe that actually some things are true and should be true in every part of the world and for everyone? So postmodernism as a denial of absolute truth falls down in different places. But there's another way of looking at truth, and that is to say, if ultimately there's no God, if we live in a world that is nothing more than a material, physical place, then where do we get this idea of truth from? And if we are just the result of an evolutionary process and nothing more, then how do we account for this idea of truth? The person who first raised this question was a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga. And he basically put forward the argument in this way. He said, look, if at the end of the day we are just the product of the evolutionary process and nothing more, then the thing that has driven that process and has resulted in us being who we are today is the need for survival. And he says, therefore, the need for survival is the most important thing, and truth is going to be subsidiary to that. It's not as important. And actually, therefore, he says, why should we think that the products of our brains that have been designed ultimately to survive rather than to discover truth, particularly in the metaphysical realm, are actually trustworthy? Now, Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher, but actually there are plenty of philosophers and thinkers who are not Christian who've raised the same question and seen the same implication. Thomas Nagel was quoted at lunchtime. In fact, his book, Mind and Cosmos, of which this is a quote, is on the bookstall if you'd like to read it in German. But he says in the introduction, evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. He says, ultimately, if that's all you have to explain mind and cosmos, as his book suggests, it's very hard to explain your mind and your rationality and your belief in such things as truth. Or the philosopher John Gray put it this way, modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. And actually, this implication of the evolutionary world picture was realized by the guy who theorized about it himself, Charles Darwin. In a letter to a friend of his, he wrote this: "But with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or are at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are convictions in such a mind?" See, what all of these people are saying is, if that's all you have to explain who you are as a human being, it's very difficult to account for our belief in truth. It's very difficult to find a foundation for it. And that's why I think it's worth looking again at the Christian faith, because the Christian faith says actually there is a foundation for such a thing as objective truth. And that's because we are more than just the result of an evolutionary process. We are created in the image of a God who is rational. And being created in the image of a rational God means that we reflect something of that rationality. We have a brain that can discover truth and is encouraged to discover truth. And it's a good thing to do that. Now, you might say at this point, that sounds kind of ironic though, because you're saying that Christianity is the foundation for the very concept of truth. But for many of us, I guess, we might assume that actually Christianity is the biggest fake news going. Surely Christianity is just a good example of some 2,000-year-old fake news that has been quite successful in being perpetuated down through the generations and around the world. Well, to help us think about that, I want to just mention and show you a clip from this film. The film is called The Invention of Lying. It's directed by, and the lead actor is a guy called Ricky Gervais. You may know him from a British television series called The Office. And he's quite outspoken for his belief that there is no God. He's an atheist. And that certainly comes through in the film. The film is telling the story of a man called Mark, who he plays, who lives in a world where no one can lie. Everybody has to tell the truth. And then on one particular day, Mark discovers a unique ability, the ability of lying. And in a world where everyone tells the truth and therefore assumes that other people are telling the truth, he has a lot of fun with his ability to lie. He can walk into a bank and he can say to the bank manager, "I have lots of money, give it to me now," and the bank manager does it. He can walk up to the lead actress in the film and say to her, "I am a really good-looking guy," and for some reason she seems to be blind, and she believes it. But things take a different turn when his mother is in hospital and she's dying. And I want to show you now the clip of what happens next. It's a very powerful scene, isn't it? It's very moving. And yet, the reality, of course, is that what Ricky Gervais is saying through that scene is that all of that it's a lie. That this belief in this supernatural power, this belief that there is life beyond this life, this belief that there might be something more, all of it is just a lie. And the reason why people believe it is that they want it to be true. It's some kind of wish fulfillment. Now, actually, of course, Ricky Gervais wasn't the first person to put that idea forwards. Feuerbach and then Freud were both thinkers who put this idea forward that Christianity and religion was just some form of psychological crutch. But what are we to make of that? We're going to look at this, Anna's going to look at it later in the week in one of the lunchtime talks. But it's worth saying at this point at least just one thing. If Christianity isn't true, and if there is no God, then that is a very good explanation for why people might still believe it. Because they want it to be true. But also it's worth saying that if Christianity actually is true, and there is a God, and there is a day of judgment and life after death, then actually he has inadvertently given us another good reason why people don't believe it. And that is, of course, that people might not believe it because they don't want it to be true. Atheism, just as much as Christianity or any other religion, could be a form of wish fulfillment, couldn't it? Just for different reasons. The problem, of course, with this kind of argument is it doesn't actually help you answer the question, is it true? It just explains whether or not people might believe things, given whether or not it's true. How do I know whether a religious claim, in particular the Christian claim, is true? Well, when it comes to religion in general, what I want to say is it's actually quite hard to answer that question, isn't it? Because when we think about religion, if we think about it at all, we often assume that religion is one of two things. We think it's either a system of philosophy, a way of thinking, or we assume it's a system of morality, a way of behaving. And in both of those cases, they're subjective and they're personal, aren't they? How do I prove or demonstrate whether your philosophy is right or wrong, or whether mine is? How can I show that my morality is better than yours? You might like it, you might dislike it, you may say it works for me, you may say it doesn't, but it's very hard to objectively demonstrate that it's true or it's false. In a sense, to demonstrate whether something's true or false, it needs to be, at least in theory, falsifiable. And claims that are not in theory falsifiable are hard to know whether they're really, really true. And that's why I want to say this tonight. At the heart of the Christian claim and the Christian faith is something that I think is unique in that it's different in this regard. The heart of the Christian faith is not just a system of philosophy, a system of thinking, or a system of morality, a system of behavior. The heart of the Christian faith is an event, a person, an event that's rooted in history, and an event that we're invited to investigate. The events of Jesus' life and his death, and in particular and crucially, his resurrection from the dead. And right throughout the last 2,000 years, Christianity has stood on that foundation of this objective historical event. And in a sense, what that invites us to do is to investigate it, objectively and historically. And that's what we want to encourage you to do this week. Why don't you just take, for a second, this book that's on your table. This is actually one of the accounts of the life of Jesus. And just look on page 4 for a second. If you can read German, you can read this one. If you can't, like me, you can read it from up here. But this is in English, what this hopefully says in German. And this is the introduction or the prologue to this biography, you might say, of the life of Jesus. Luke, a medical doctor, writes, "Many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught." So what Luke is doing right at the beginning of this document is he's saying, actually, I'm inviting you to investigate and to look into the basis of this claim. Christianity opens itself up to a historical and objective investigation where you can actually ask those questions about whether it's really true. Now, of course, you may have lots of questions about whether this book, of course, 2,000 years on, written in a different language or translated into a different language, is true. We can't go into great detail tonight, but there might be 4 good questions that would be worth asking of it. When, who, why, and how. Firstly, when was it written? And we have very good reason for thinking that it was written in the 1st century. Almost every scholar would agree that. We've got manuscript evidence of the Gospel accounts from early in the 2nd century. And we know that this wasn't written hundreds of years later, at a time when myths could have evolved, but at a time when contemporaries of the events would have still been alive. Secondly, the question is who? Well, who wrote them? Well, of course, in scholarship, there is an amount of debate about the authorship of the Gospels. But what is generally agreed upon is that actually within the Gospels, we have genuine eyewitness testimony. If you want to look at a book that investigates that in more detail, a scholar called Richard Bauckham, in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is an excellent book to go to. He's a scholar at St Andrews University in Scotland. But thirdly, the important question you might want to ask is why? Why would the authors of these books write the kind of things that they do? Was it just to perpetuate fake news? Did they stand something to gain? And what is really important to remember at this point is that actually in the 1st century, and indeed for the following 3 centuries, those who believed what they believed about Jesus and shared what they believed about Jesus stood to gain nothing politically or economically, and actually stood to lose a lot. Most of the first followers of Jesus were persecuted. Indeed, many of them were killed for their belief in Jesus and for the resurrection. So you have to ask the question, why on earth would they invent this fake news if, as it did, it got them into such great trouble? When I was a child, I used to make up stories quite a lot. I used to say things like, my sister did it, or the dog ate it, or it was on fire when I arrived. Those kind of stories. And I would always make up stories to get myself out of trouble. And normally my sister or the dog into trouble. But I never, ever made up a story to get myself into trouble. Because that's not what people do, is it? And yet, why on earth would the gospel writers make up stories that actually got them into the greatest trouble of all, if it wasn't based on something that was real or true? It's a big question to ask. And then fourthly, the question we might want to ask is how? How did such ideas gain such traction so quickly? We know from the Roman historian Tacitus that within 20 years, this had spread like wildfire right to the heart of the Roman Empire, Rome itself. How did this gain such traction and such popularity, despite the fact the full weight of all of the authorities was against it, and despite the fact these claims would have been so easily falsifiable to the people in the first century who were around at the time? So I want to say, before we write this thing off as fake news, we need to ask the question, how do we account for these things? And maybe, just maybe, this is worth investigating in more detail. Now that doesn't, of course, prove that it's true. And technically speaking, of course, proof is not something that you find outside of mathematics. But there are good reasons for taking it seriously and for asking some serious questions about it. Now, of course, there are many claims in this book that you can't necessarily investigate objectively by other sources, and some claims that would be difficult to do so. I mean, the claim of the virgin birth, for instance, would be quite difficult to kind of investigate in that way. But there is a very big claim, right at the heart of the Christian faith, that has been investigated critically and is able to be investigated. And that is not only that Jesus lived, for billions of others have done that. Not only that he died, for everyone who has ever lived and will ever live will at some point do that. But uniquely that he rose from the dead. Now we're going to look at that claim more on Thursday lunchtime if you want to look at the details of it. But can I say, if we're looking at the topic of truth, that is an investigation that we can make. Let me tell you a story. A friend of mine, Peter, went to a university in the south of England, a university called Bristol. And while he was at university, they had a similar Christian student group to the one that has organised these events this week. At around Easter time, they decided to organise an event called the Great Resurrection Debate. And they took out a centre-page advert in their student newspaper. And they invited people to give an account for their explanation for the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, other than that Jesus rose from the dead. And they outlined a number of the pieces of evidence that almost all scholars, Jewish, atheist, or Christian, would agree upon. The fact of Jesus' death, the fact of the empty tomb, the fact that his disciples for some reason were convinced that they had encountered him risen from the dead, the fact of the explosion of the Christian movement in the first century. And they explained this, and then they invited people to give a written response, and then the entries would be shortlisted down to, I think it was 5, and they would be invited to come and address a gathering in the students' union bar over cheese and wine, to explain their theory. And then a High Court judge, who himself wasn't a Christian, was invited to adjudicate and award a £500 cash prize, which, this was 10 years ago, was quite a lot. Actually, for a student, that is still quite a lot, isn't it? Anyway, this happened. People submitted their entries. The event came around. People enjoyed their cheese and wine. And 2 interesting things happened over the course of that evening and beyond. The first is that the High Court judge who was adjudicating, who, remember, wasn't himself a committed Christian, said in his closing remarks that all of these explanations that had been given to try and explain away the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus would have not stood up in a court of law, and that ultimately they were very weak. But the second thing that happened is that the guy who actually won the £500, he gave a kind of version of what some people call the swoon theory, that Jesus hadn't actually physically died on the cross. As he accepted his prize, actually admitted that he himself wasn't convinced by the explanation that he had given, but he was very happy to receive the £500, thank you very much. But then something else happened. In the weeks after this event, having investigated it more, He himself actually became a committed Christian, having become convinced of the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I'm not suggesting that after such a brief investigation tonight that that's necessarily convinced you, and I'd invite you to come back on Thursday. But what we are saying is Christianity invites that kind of objective investigation, and we invite you to do that this week. And a great way to start would be to actually take away one of these accounts of the life of Jesus and to read it for yourself. Another thing to do would be to maybe look at some of those books on the bookstall that investigate some of these questions in more detail and read them. And of course, another thing to do would be to keep coming to these events and to keep asking your questions. And we'd happily do that. And we'll normally provide you with a coffee and some food as we discuss those questions too. But can I just say this as I finish? The heart of the Christian claim is not only that there is such a thing as objective truth. The heart of the Christian faith is not just that Christianity is objectively true. The heart of the Christian claim is not even just that Jesus speaks truth. But actually, the heart of the Christian claim in regard to truth is that in the person of Jesus, we find truth personified or embodied. Because actually, in one of the other accounts of Jesus' life, he says this. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Jesus doesn't just claim to say that he's got the truth, but he says he is the truth. And so if you want to see truth and encounter truth, encounter Jesus. Can I say just why I think that's important as I close? I think one of the reasons why maybe we're suspicious of the idea of objective truth sometimes, or we're concerned, particularly when religious people start talking about this concept of truth, is we can see how sometimes truth claims can be used aggressively or oppressively to bolster one's position and to oppress and subjugate others. And so we're fearful of the way that truth has been used. And can I say, when I look at the person of Jesus, who claimed to be truth, I see something that is so different. Because Jesus, who claimed to be the truth, said that he hadn't come to be served, but to serve. He hadn't come so that other people have to do what he wants, but he came to serve them. And he didn't come to use his truth as a sword or a weapon to attack his enemies, but as the truth. He willingly dies at the hands of his enemies and for his enemies. And so, can I say, if you see that truth as something that is dangerous or oppressive or ugly, can I invite you to look at the person of Jesus in these historical accounts? Because I think what you'll discover is that potentially not only is this true, but it's also beautiful. And if truth looks like Jesus Christ, then maybe that's a truth that we'd really want to investigate. Not a truth that's too good to be true, but so good because it is true. But listen, we're going to have some music, which will give us an opportunity to think about that. And then there'll be a time to be messaging your questions, and we'll come back to those in a moment. But I'll hand over to the band now.
I'm only human after all. I'm only human after all. Don't put the blame on me. Don't put the blame on me.